The White House press briefing room buzzed with anticipation. Journalists from every major outlet, CNN, MSNBC, the New York Times, and a few international media houses were packed tightly into the sleek rows of seats. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and it wasn't just the usual pre-briefing chatter. Something was brewing. President Donald Trump had just returned from a high-profile summit with world leaders in Geneva where he delivered a fiery speech on energy independence, American sovereignty, and a shocking new trade pact that cut traditional European allies out of a trillion-dollar deal. The media was fuming, and Karoline Leavitt, his fierce, young, and razor-sharp White House press secretary, was about to be the first line of defense. "She's walking into the lion's den today," whispered a reporter from the Washington Post to his colleague from NPR. "We've got coordinated questions lined up. Let's see how she spins this disaster." Karoline, in her trademark navy blue dress and confident posture, entered the room like a force of nature. Only 30, and already holding one of the most scrutinized positions in the nation, she exuded calm authority as she approached the podium. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice steady, cutting through the tension like a knife. "Let's begin." Immediately, hands shot up. Jim Deacon from CNN was first. He'd earned a reputation for grandstanding and dramatic flair, especially during the Trump administration. He wasted no time. "Karoline," he began with a smirk, "why did the president exclude our European allies from the recent energy deal? Isn't that a betrayal of our traditional alliances?" Karoline didn't blink. "Thanks for the question, Jim. Actually, the president's decision was rooted in American economic interests. For too long, our country has shouldered unfair burdens while watching jobs and opportunities ship overseas. The president's new pact prioritizes American workers, boosts our domestic energy sector, and aligns with the voters who elected him to make bold changes." Jim tried to interject, but Karoline raised a hand. "And for the record, several European leaders have already reached out to renegotiate under the new terms. That's what real leadership looks like, setting the terms, not taking dictation." A few chuckles rose from the conservative press section. But the liberal flank wasn't done. Next came Sophia Klein from MSNBC. "Karoline, isn't it true that the president's trade decisions are being made to benefit his campaign donors in the oil and gas industries? There's an ethics complaint filed just this morning." Karoline leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowed. "Sophia, I know you're referring to the complaint filed by a partisan watchdog group that has ties to the DNC. And if you read past the headline, which I assume you didn't, you'd see that the complaint is baseless, based entirely on speculation and zero evidence. The president's actions are guided by policy, not politics. And frankly, Americans are tired of the media playing gotcha games instead of doing real journalism." Sophia's face flushed. The cameras were rolling. The internet was watching. Then came the big guns. Gerald Hornstein of the New York Times stood slowly, clutching his notebook like it contained nuclear codes. "Karoline, in light of the Geneva summit and the president's so-called America First posture, many are calling his behavior erratic, even dangerous. World leaders are reportedly alarmed. What do you say to those who claim this administration is destabilizing global alliances?" Karoline smiled a slow, calculated smile. The kind that said, "I was waiting for this." "Gerald," she began, "your newspaper ran that headline before the summit even began. Your editorial board decided the president was erratic before he even stepped off Air Force One. That's not journalism. That's a narrative." She paused, letting the room sit in silence. "And as for the world being alarmed, I think they're surprised that for once an American president showed backbone. Surprised that we're not apologizing but leading. If that destabilizes the old order, maybe the old order needed a little shaking." A quiet murmur rippled through the room. Phones buzzed. Twitter lit up. The trap the liberal press had set was unraveling. But this was just the beginning. As Karoline Leavitt closed her folder and prepared for the next question, she already sensed it coming, a coordinated pivot from policy criticism to personal attacks. A tactic as old as Washington itself. And right on cue, Rachel Mendoza from Politico stood up. Her tone, icy but wrapped in professional politeness, pierced the quiet tension. "Karoline, many have pointed out that you have no prior foreign policy experience, yet you're speaking with immense authority on matters of international trade, diplomacy, and security. Doesn't your lack of credentials weaken the credibility of this administration's messaging?" There was an audible gasp from a few in the room. Even among hardened journalists, this was a low blow. But Karoline didn't flinch. Rachel, she said calmly, I may not have spent decades climbing bureaucratic ladders or sitting on think tank panels sipping lattes and discussing hypotheticals. But I do have something Washington often lacks: clarity, conviction, and the courage to speak directly to the American people. Her voice grew firm but measured. My experience comes from working under a president who disrupted the status quo, delivered historic job growth, and dared to challenge the globalist echo chamber that you and others worship. You want credentials? Try communicating with 350 million Americans every day and standing firm while elites mock everything you stand for. That's real-world experience. Rachel opened her mouth to speak, but Karoline was already pivoting. Next question. But the media wasn't finished. A reporter from NPR, Thomas Bell, jumped in without being called. Karoline, let's talk about the disinformation your office continues to spread. Fact-checkers have flagged at least 5 false or misleading statements from your last briefing. How do you justify knowingly promoting propaganda? The room tensed. The word propaganda was a loaded gun, and Thomas had pulled the trigger. Karoline's eyes narrowed slightly, but her voice remained cool. Thomas, I understand that in your world, anything that contradicts your editorial board's worldview is misinformation. But let's be honest here. These fact-checkers are unelected, unaccountable, and overwhelmingly aligned with left-leaning media outlets. They are not arbiters of truth, they're enforcers of narrative. She paused, letting her words hang heavy. And if you want to talk about propaganda, she continued, maybe we should review the last 3 years of stories your network ran, from Russia collusion hoaxes to Hunter Biden's laptop being dismissed as disinformation just weeks before an election. The American people haven't forgotten. A few claps erupted from the back, independent reporters and conservative outlets, stunned by her surgical precision. Thomas sat down, visibly shaken. But then came the final attempt, the knockout punch. Erin Lamont, a prominent activist journalist with 1 million Twitter followers, rose from the side. She wasn't officially on the press list, but she'd been given a temporary press pass by a sympathetic media group. She cleared her throat. Karoline, as a woman, how do you justify working for a man accused of sexism, racism, and dismantling democratic norms? You're young, educated, don't you feel complicit in a movement that many believe endangers marginalized communities? It was the kind of question designed to ignite a firestorm. Social media gold? An attempt to corner Karoline into a defensive posture, or worse, a viral misstep. But Karoline didn't bite. Instead, she leaned slightly toward the microphone and said, Erin, thank you for your question. I'm glad you asked it because I think it reflects something toxic and deeply patronizing in modern media and politics. Her tone sharpened. You're implying that because I'm a woman, I should think a certain way. That I'm betraying my gender by holding views you disagree with. That's not feminism. That's ideological bullying dressed up as empowerment. Now she was rolling. I work for a president who promoted me based on merit, who values strength and loyalty, and who trusts me to speak on behalf of the American people. I didn't get here because of quotas or identity politics. I got here because I worked hard, I fought for my beliefs, and I earned it. Silence. Total silence. Even her critics were stunned. Karoline didn't just hold the line, she drew a new one. And suddenly, the trap the liberal press had set turned into a platform, a megaphone for millions watching at home, tired of media games, hungry for someone who wouldn't back down. But the biggest twist was yet to come. As Karoline stepped back from the podium, the atmosphere in the White House press briefing room had shifted. The smug grins from earlier had vanished. Phones were now clutched, not for smug tweets, but to nervously message editors and producers. She flipped it on us. But Karoline wasn't finished. She adjusted the mic, and the room quieted again. You know, she began, voice calm but unmistakably sharpened, for years, conservatives, especially young conservatives like myself, have been told to sit down, be quiet, and let the media define our truth. You call it fact-checking. We call it gatekeeping. Camera lenses zoomed in, lights focusing tighter on her face. This wasn't just a press conference anymore, it was a political moment. Karoline continued, the real story here isn't what the president did in Geneva. It's not about energy deals or trade or who got invited to what summit. The real story is the growing divide between the American people and the institutions that claim to represent them, and I'm talking about you. She pointed gently across the room, not accusing but addressing the elephant in it. The media doesn't just report news anymore, it manufactures outrage, filters truth through ideology, and silences dissenting voices under the guise of protecting democracy. but the American people see through it. They saw through it in 2016, again in 2020, and again when they elected Donald J. Trump once more to put this country back on course. A fire ignited in the room. Even some liberal reporters squirmed in their seats. She took a breath, then delivered her counterpunch. I have here, she said, pulling out a folder, a list of false stories, not questionable ones, not debatable ones, false stories your outlets have published in the past 5 years. She started listing them, one by one. Trump colluded with Russia, disproven. Border agents whipped migrants, never happened. Inflation was transitory, we're still living it. The Hunter Biden laptop was Russian disinfo, now admitted to be real. She looked up, and every one of those stories had major coverage in this room. But none of you apologized. Not once. Whispers broke out. Erin Lamont looked like she wanted to crawl under her chair. Jim from CNN glanced nervously toward the exit. Karoline closed the folder. I say this not to score points, but because you've lost something sacred, the trust of the American people. And while you may hate this administration, this president, and yes, me, you cannot deny that we are winning that trust back, not by spin, but by standing firm. Boom. Like a gavel dropping. As she turned toward the next question, something strange happened. Peter Walsh from Newsweek, usually one of her toughest critics, raised his hand. Slowly. Cautiously. Karoline, he said, more softly than before, you've clearly come prepared. But surely you see some merit and concerns about transparency and accountability. Karoline nodded. Of course. Accountability matters. But it must be mutual. If you're going to hold this administration accountable, and you should, then we're going to hold you accountable too. That's the deal. The room sat frozen. Karoline glanced at the clock. We've got time for one more. But nobody raised a hand. Nobody. And that's when it became clear Karoline Leavitt had just flipped the script in the most hostile press room in America. As Karoline stepped away from the podium and exited the briefing room, reporters remained frozen in their seats, some still processing what had just happened. Others stared blankly at their laptops. The gotcha headlines they'd prepared now useless. A few turned to each other in hushed tones, murmuring things like, "She destroyed us," and "We walked into a trap." Backstage, the White House communications team erupted in quiet celebration. "Karoline, that was a masterclass," said Jackson Reed, the deputy press secretary, barely containing his grin. But Karoline was already back in strategist mode. That was just the beginning. Wait until it hit social. And it did. Within an hour, clips of the briefing exploded across every platform. On X, formerly Twitter, the hashtag Karoline Clapsback trended #1 worldwide. Conservative commentator Ben Shapiro posted, Karoline Leavitt just gave the most devastating dismantling of media bias we've seen in the White House press room in decades. Absolute fire. Tucker Carlson's network aired a special titled, The Woman Who Silenced the Swamp, Karoline Leavitt Strikes Back. Even centrist outlets like Axios and The Hill ran headlines such as, Leavitt's shock performance flips media narrative on its head. But the most surprising reaction came from the very people who had tried to corner her. Rachel Mendoza from Politico, in an op-ed later that evening, admitted, Leavitt didn't dodge the tough questions, she bulldozed them. Agree or not with her politics, her poise, precision, and unapologetic confidence are undeniable. Thomas Bell from NPR didn't apologize, but his follow-up article featured a tone more cautious, almost defensive. Leavitt weaponized the media's own record against it, and in doing so may have redrawn the battle lines. And Erin Lamont? Her viral post that attempted to mock Karoline backfired. Her followers, typically progressive, accused her of failing to stand her ground, while others pointed out that Karoline had handled herself with more feminism than the feminists. Karoline didn't respond to any of the noise. She didn't need to. She had already moved on, focused on her next mission, messaging the president's new legislative push. But inside the West Wing, something else was brewing. President Trump, sitting in the Oval Office with his chief of staff, watched a replay of the briefing on a large monitor. He leaned back in his chair, smiling. I told you, he said, jabbing his finger in the air. She's the best. She doesn't just handle the media. She makes them look like amateurs. The chief of staff chuckled. Should we have her do more than press briefings? Trump leaned forward, hands on the desk. Keep her exactly where she is. Let them come for her again. I dare them. But even Trump didn't know what was about to happen next. The day after the briefing, Karoline received a private invitation, not from a conservative media outlet, not from a think tank, but from a group of moderate Democrats on Capitol Hill. They wanted to meet, not to argue, not to accuse, but to talk. Because despite their political opposition, they'd seen something in Karoline's performance that transcended party lines. Authenticity. A trait in short supply in Washington. Karoline took the meeting. Inside a quiet Capitol office, she faced 3 representatives, 2 Democrats and 1 independent. "I'll be honest," said one, "I don't agree with your boss. But what you did in that room yesterday, that was real. And the country needs more of it. Left or right?" Karoline leaned in, thoughtful. "I don't expect everyone to agree with me," she said. "But I do expect them to stop pretending people like me don't belong here." They nodded. The atmosphere was respectful, even warm. And just like that, Karoline Leavitt had done something few ever accomplish in Washington. She silenced her critics and earned their respect. But the media wasn't going to let this go unanswered. A major network, angry, embarrassed, and desperate for revenge, began to dig hard. And what they found could change everything.